So on the one hand, the media ecology itself is pushing us to reconsume content, but at the same time, the same media ecology is also making us want to read new things or need to read new things because more is better. We have this more is better ideology, this neoliberal pressure of self-improvement. So rereading is such a big topic, and it is understudied and underdefined also. In a very simple way, rereading, just understanding the term intuitively, would mean going back to a book that you've already read. And it's a practice that readers will engage in all the time, and readers of all kinds. So it could be ordinary readers who are reading for fun, but particularly it could be specialized readers who are literary critics, teaching literature, engaging with literature professionally, who will reread all the time. So literary criticism has rereading folded in it. Nobody's writing about a book, nobody's analyzing a book by reading it once. So the literature that exists already on rereading tries to understand it from this perspective of the specialized reader who will always reread books to teach, to research, to write about them. One of the scholars I really keep going back to is this Romanian literary critic, Matei Calinescu, who basically talks about just how inherent to literary criticism rereading is, and therefore wants to lay bare some of these assumptions of rereading that we have in the practice of literary criticism. But I think it's not just specialized readers who are rereading, but everybody. People will reread books for comfort, they will reread books out of ritual, they will do it out of habit. As I'm finding out recently, they will even do it because an adaptation of their favorite book came out and that made them nostalgic, and they will go back to reread books. And there have been some studies, of course. One on ordinary readers. So Alison Waller's Rereading Childhood Books, I think, is a very important piece of literature, in particularly in examining how ordinary readers, so people who are not professors or literary critics, will reread books, remember books from childhood. But my intervention really in this subfield of research is looking at what happens to rereading and our understanding of rereading in this digital age of platforms where we will be fed content that we're not exactly always asking for. So in what ways are platforms changing the meanings associated with rereading? How are they changing the practices associated with rereading? And how probably they're also just creating rereading-like conditions of consumption. The point is, we will either reread books or we will be made to reread books through what is called quantified or engineered nostalgia. Or even if we're not rereading books themselves, we might re-encounter that story world, that narrative, through different modalities and different platforms. Just right now, The Summer I Turned Pretty is a good example where it's a trilogy of young adult books from between 2009 and 2011, and it has been made into a 3-part Amazon Prime original adaptation starting 2022, and the 3rd season just came out this summer. So that's a case study that I've been looking at right now, because there are people who are actually going back to the books because they became nostalgic. There are people who are going back to books and showing their sort of dog-eared copies of the original covers also to prove that they are OG fans, and they're not just bandwagon fans who have jumped onto this because of this very popular TV series. But outside of this, there's also just this conditions of rereading in the consumption of this content anyway, because if you're engaging in TikTok commentary, if you're on Goodreads reading reviews, there are people who are talking about this TV series as if they're rereading it because they have read the books, so they're talking about it assuming that everybody else has prior knowledge. I think rereading on BookTok is so interesting because a lot of what happens on BookTok, and I think across bookish cultures on the internet, is about quantity, and it's about reading a lot. So you will see these inflated reading challenges where people will talk about how they read 100 books this year. They will show never-ending sky-high piles of TBRs, like to be read books. They will a lot of what is happening on these platforms, including Goodreads, which is not even such a visual platform, is a focus on quantity, is a focus on reading more, showing off almost that you are a reader, and doing that through quantity, right? And we see that across all the platforms. So you're a real reader if you're reading a lot. I need to mention here that there's of course countercultures here, where there is something like slow reading, where people will say you don't have to read 50 books a year to be a reader. But primarily what I see is this focus on quantity and reading a lot. Even if you're not reading a lot, at least you're consuming a lot of books by buying them, collecting them, displaying them in your little shelfies behind you. And against this backdrop, I think rereading is very interesting, because then you're going back to a book that you've already read. You're not really consuming something new. And that really stands in such stark contrast against some of the practices that are so common on reading platforms. So I think that is what makes it interesting for me, and not just rereading on TikTok, but rereading in general. Because as I said, on the one hand, we're being pushed to reconsume content because the same content will get repackaged. So on the one hand, the media ecology itself is pushing us to reconsume content. But at the same time, the same media ecology is also making us want to read new things or need to read new things, because more is better. We have this more is better ideology, this neoliberal pressure of self-improvement through reading. And so against all of this, I think rereading has this sort of, it's a double-sided phenomenon, and that's what makes it very, very interesting to me. I think rereading is a very transformative practice, because books, as Alison Waller has said, like the scholar I just mentioned, books become these emblematic waymarks on your journey towards adulthood. So things that you've read before can become these posts that you keep returning to when you grow up. So you will see your own revisions of taste. You will see how you've grown up. So in that sense, it's a deeply transformative practice, and this is something that previous research has looked at. What I'm again wanting to do here is to look at what happens to rereading when people are talking about it on these different platforms. And I think that's where I use the term expressions of rereading. And again, expressions of rereading are not unique to digital platforms. So if you think about something like bibliomemoirs, which have again existed throughout history, they are expressions of reading, but also rereading, where people are going back to books that they've read, and basically charting their autobiography through the books that they've read across their lifespan. So expressions of rereading are not unique to digital platforms, but the way that they manifest on digital platforms is unique, which makes them doubly transformative. So I think a great example is, again, the use of sound memes or memes in general to talk about the books that you've reread on TikTok. And I'm sure this happens on several other platforms. So there's this one, and again, it's a trend, right? It's not even just one video, it became a trend. So it's a snippet from the Gilmore Girls, where Rory is saying to Jess, "I thought you didn't read much." And then he says, "Well, I've read this 40 times, or what is much?" So basically, it's this very bookish, very nerdy conversation between Jess and Rory in the Gilmore Girls, which in itself is such a reread text. So that adds a layer of bookish identity to these videos. So people will use this snippet, just this snippet, it's I think 10 seconds, and they will just flip through a obviously reread copy, because there's so many annotations and it's dog-eared and there's stains of coffee, and so there's like the book itself has visible marks of being read and reread. And this is all happening against the backdrop of this, "I thought you didn't read much. Oh, what is much?" Or that snippet. So I think that's where it's doubly transformative, because rereading in itself is a transformative practice, as I just said. But when expressions of rereading co-opt these sort of modalities of being on this platform, these memes, these snippets, they become doubly transformative, because what it means to relate to a reread book takes a different form, because this is then also becoming a collective experience. Because as I said, this Rory Gilmore snippet, it wasn't just one video. There are hundreds of videos which will use that same video, that same sort of visual grammar of sort of flipping through the book, and the book is either on a bed or it's placed against more books. So it's the same visual grammar, it's the same snippet, but then it's a different person showing a different book. And then there's also additional modalities that have come into play. So one of the videos I examined, this is a person who's showing, it's the same snippet, but then she's showing her old copy of this book that she read when she was a teenager, and it's literally falling apart because she has read it so much. And then now she's gone on to buy a hardcover book because she's not done rereading it. So again, there are these very sort of individual expressions coming in, but in this very sort of platformized and memified way. This is so different, for instance, from writing a bibliomemoir, which is long, and then you really get to have a say about how your life has shaped around these different books that you've read, versus you have 10 seconds, a snippet from the Gilmore Girls, and one book that you can just flip through. So I think that's where it becomes doubly transformative. What drew me really to BookTok in the beginning was it was a very grassroots practice where there were just people, often young people, older teenagers, very young adults who are talking about books that they like. So what I liked about that was just having proof that reading is not dead. People are reading. Maybe they're not reading books that their teachers would like them to. Maybe they're not reading the classics. What drew me to it was really this idea of ordinary people, young people, just reading books for the fun of it. And they're annotating books, and they're doodling in the margins, and they're doing all the things that ordinary readers do, but then now we're seeing it and we're building communities around it. I don't know if this is coming from a place of loss, but I think it has gotten a little bit more commercialized, as things often happen with when any practice becomes this big, and this when it becomes such a vector for the flow of capital. I think that's where the loss comes in, where we see so many influencers now. And again, nothing wrong with influencers, but I think we've gone a little bit from the very early days of BookTok, where it was just people talking about books that they like, to again the industry itself seeping into these grassroots practices, so it doesn't make it as grassroots, right? So we will see some of these big influencers getting PR boxes where then they have a book and then they're reading about it, and I'm pretty sure that they're still reading these books, but I think it has become unrecognizable. And I'm not really saying if this is a good thing or a bad thing, because the publishing industry has been able to resurrect parts of itself even through this medium, this platform. So I think that's in itself a good thing. But there has been a difference, because I think that there is a lot more. It used to be way more bottom up, but we also do see a lot of like top down approaches where the publishing industry itself, like Penguin Random House, has a brilliant TikTok account actually, which is such a good example of these two worlds sort of colliding and creating something that it wasn't before. So I use videos from Penguin's TikTok account very often, because they keep up with the trends. They will make content that's very much on the mark, and like with where bookish content on TikTok is going. But it is still Penguin Random House. It is one of the 5 biggest publishers in the world, I think, if I'm not wrong. There has been this shift, and I think this shift is not unexpected. It is everywhere in bookstores now. It is in the media. It is in the publishing industry. I also think about how banal it has become in a sense. I have a picture of this best of BookTok display that I saw back in the day in 2021 in this bookstore in Rome. And I often use that to sort of start discussions with students, to open my lectures, to get the conversation going, right? And I have seen a steady shift in the reactions that I get to this one picture, because the first year I have had pearl clutching and just shock that there is this frivolous app that is percolating physical bookstores, and some people were upset about it, some people were excited about it, but there was strong emotion across the board, because this was so new and this was so unexpected. Because we did have BookTok, of course, follows from this larger genealogy of Bookstagram, BookTube, right? But we did not have best of BookTube bookstores, book displays in the bookstore. So that was a novelty, and there were strong emotions about it on both sides of the spectrum. And across the years now, 4 years into it, I have seen such a steady shift in the reactions I will get from the best of BookTok display picture that I show, because now when I showed it to my first year bachelor students once, I got no reaction from them, because to them it was so normal. So I think they were just thinking about what it is that I'm going on about, because yes, it exists. So I think it has gone from being something very new to being such a commonplace thing, that the rise of book talk has given rise to entire genres. So again, new adult, for instance, as a genre has existed. Publishers have tried to make it a genre to capitalize on older adults' love for young adult books by creating this new sort of new genre, new age category called new adult. But it didn't take off as much as it did until these newer platforms came in, and we start seeing books like Akotar, and we start seeing these skating and ice skating sport oriented love stories. There's another one called The Love Hypothesis. So these are all books that are really 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 popular on BookTok, and they are popular as a result of what the platform is doing. That has led to a shift in publishing practices themselves, I think, where you will actually find TikTok made me buy the stickers on books themselves. Um, Authors will be known as TikTok phenomena now. So I think it has become a very commonplace thing in books and publishing. There's good and bad things about this, because we always run the risk of getting pushed the same books our way, because again, the platform is built around giving you the content that it thinks you will like. So this does make it a little bit of a literary echo chamber, where you're not really getting perspectives from outside the genres that you like, from other languages, translated works. In my research, I've come across creators who will go out of their way to create content from, let's say, translated literature from around the world, or literature written by women from around the world. But this is, again, for me, on my For You page, this has been way more niche than getting the same sort of, not the same videos, but getting different creatively made content, but about similar kinds of books. So that is a risk that we run, and I think that's something researchers and any sort of gatekeepers and stakeholders in the book industry need to be very aware of, and I think they are. But then there's also the good thing, where there is so much excitement about a new book coming out. So Rebecca Yaros's Onyx Storm came out right when this big TikTok ban was supposedly going to happen in the US. And there was so much discussion about what it is that publishers should do now about this new release if TikTok is going to be banned. Of course, none of that was to be, because TikTok was back on board within 12 hours when Trump came into power. But it's that big a deal that publishers started thinking about alternatives and how they could sort of reconfigure their marketing ideas and plans for this one big release, just because a platform was going to be banned, not even across the world, but in one country. It is a very important tool that publishers, authors, and authors themselves have in their toolkit, because authors themselves people have become authors also because of BookTok, where they're writing fan fiction. They start making content about it on TikTok, and then they're getting contracts. So I think it's an important tool for publishers, authors, but of course it has downsides that everybody needs to be very aware of. Talking about affect and sound on BookTok, I'm always drawn to this one video. It's made by a user called Marta. I've also had the good fortune of talking to her. She's great. She is a Taylor Swift fan. So she is a big Swiftie, and she will talk about the books that she likes and reads, and she also has a book club, but she talks about them often from the lens of the Taylor Swift fandom. So the video that that really got me thinking about sound and affect in general was a compilation of books that she has made, which make her feel like the song Cardigan from Taylor Swift makes her feel. And how the video works is that, because sound is such a fundamental infrastructural part of TikTok, that every single TikTok video will have a sound associated with it. It could either be a sound that's original, that's someone talking. So this could also end up becoming, if I say something really funny and if I manage to make a meme out of this, it could become a sound on TikTok, right? So you can have original sounds, or you can have integrated sounds that come from outside. So TikTok has a library of songs, officially licensed songs by artists. So this is, again, fair use in every single sense. So Marta, what she does is she has in the background of the video, used officially from the TikTok library, the song Cardigan from Taylor Swift. And then most importantly is dressed she very much like Taylor Swift in her folklore era. So she has the bang, she has that signature red lipstick. She also is just has features similar to Taylor Swift, has the clear eyes. So she's dressed a little bit like Taylor Swift. So if you know the lore, if you know what's going on, you will see this person and be like, wait, what? Is this Taylor Swift? So she has that going on. She has the sound. And then she has a compilation of maybe 5 or 6 books where she's showing literally the covers of the books that made her feel like the song Cardigan made her feel. She doesn't say a single word in this entire video. She doesn't verbalize this feeling, but this affect, the affective element really comes out from listening to the Taylor Swift song, which again, in that moment in history, 2020, was a very big thing. A lot of people will associate their early lockdown experience with that song because she comes out with this album. It's a surprise. People love it. It's also a departure from what she's done. So here we see these entanglements of sound and affect, because this video wouldn't work without the sound. It is really built around this oral experience of listening to this song, and then it's connected to the more sort of literary experience of reading the books. This is one example that got me thinking about how structures of sound and feeling are central to what's going on TikTok. And of course, I'm nowhere close to the first person to talk about affect on BookTok, because some of the earliest research already back in 2021 was beginning to look at how much feeling and talking about feeling there is on BookTok. So it is very much not an entire departure from how reviews work, but it does show that there is a very big emphasis on talking about how a book made you feel, this very personal relationship with a book. And this relationship often, in several cases, will be mediated by sound. It can be something as touching and heartfelt as a song that you liked, or it can be a meme that because sound memes are a big thing on TikTok. So it's something that Emily and I have looked at in one of our previous research, where it doesn't really have to be, even if you're saying something heartfelt about the book, the sound doesn't have to be heartfelt. It can be ironic, because that's where just this media literacy of consumers of BookTok content comes in, because if you've been on there long enough and if you know the myths and the lores, you will understand what's going on. And without the sound, this wouldn't work. There can be a lot of TikTok videos that are very incomprehensible. Also BookTok videos, like I do spend a lot of my working hours looking at this content, and every so often there will be something that I absolutely don't understand, because TikTok is made essentially of sides. Their sides of TikToks are basically niches. So BookTok is a side, Clean Talk is a side. So these are niche environments which within themselves will have sub-niches. There will be parts about BookTok that even I, as a BookTok researcher, won't understand. So if you're entirely new to TikTok, perhaps there will be more content that's incomprehensible. But again, it probably won't reach you as often. So I am sure that there's so much content out there on TikTok that I would never understand. But it doesn't reach me because my interaction with the platform creates data points for the platform to then give me content that I will most likely, statistically, given my gender, demographic, location, I am more likely to understand. So there is, of course, incomprehensible stuff, and I encounter it every now and then. But I think the platform also tries to give you things that you will probably appreciate. I think short videos on BookTok are indeed capable of communicating very nuanced descriptions, feelings about books, simply because they're made for a specific audience that understands them. So if there is someone who says this doesn't make sense, it's because it's not supposed to make sense for them, but there is an entire population out there on the platform to whom this does make sense. It's not about whether you like being on the platform or whether you like the content, but it's about finding ways to describe what's going on, to make nameable and understandable a reading condition that's happening right now, and to really talk about whether these can these can talk about books in sophisticated ways. I think it's not a question of whether they can. They are, because if they weren't, it wouldn't have had this kind of impact. Again, I go back to talking about it is not a question of whether individual researchers or adults or gatekeepers of books in whatever form, librarians, teachers, publishers, like this content. Because it is very likely that you probably won't like it because it's not meant for you, but it is doing something significant and big to the extent that I think BookTok is something that goes beyond TikTok now, because there was a moment in the January of 2024, I think, when TikTok was banned in the US for, I think, not more than 12 hours. And in that moment still, we saw just the BookTok community wanting to migrate onto other platforms. So BookTok as a thing could also exist outside of TikTok itself, because it is now a tag. It's a paratext. So I don't think it's a question of whether they can communicate about books in a sophisticated way, because what is sophisticated, of course, is subjective. So I think we need to reframe the question and talk about these books, these videos are doing something about books. How do we understand them? How do we talk about them? And that is essentially what I've been trying to do in my work. So platformization, I think, is a very important concept here, because TikTok is a platform, Instagram is a platform. These are all platforms. And what this term means is cultural practices will get reorganized around platforms, and the platform itself will then respond to these clusters of cultural practices around them by doing something different within the platform itself. So a good example, and I often use it when I'm teaching, is, let's say, the TikTok Book Awards, right? So TikTok in itself was never meant to be a book. It isn't about books, the platform in itself. It's a video consumption platform where people will make videos of all kinds of things. But because BookTok became such a big thing, TikTok instated the first ever TikTok Book Awards. And what that means is the cultural practice of awarding books or consecrating the literary then gets reorganized. Not all of it, but a part of it gets reorganized around a platform. So we do see that this acts then as a platformization of literary awarding. So we see two things happening, where the practice itself gets reorganized around a platform, but that happened because the platform also did something, because they saw all of these practices clustering around it. So TikTok then goes on to instate a book award, which shows how the platform itself responds to cultural practices. And we see cultural practices like recommending books, reviewing books happening around platforms. So that makes platformization, I think, an essential concept to understand what's going on. So what's going on these platforms, because what is happening is reading practices and practices adjacent to reading, like reviewing, recommending, buying books, collecting books even, annotating, they are getting platformized because they get clustered and reorganized around this platform. And I think platformization is also important because reading practices, or the platformization of reading, is not happening just on TikTok. But as I said before, it happens on many, many different platforms. It happens on Instagram, Goodreads. I hear it happens on YouTube Shorts. There are newer platforms that I've been looking at. There's something called Fable. And all of these have different grammars associated with them. This is research that has already been done. Like that, there's a book called BookTok, Bookstagram, BookTube. I need to look up the title. But they actually do conduct a full comparative analysis of how bookish cultures are similar but also differ across different platforms, which sometimes will have reading adjacent practices on them. An example is, and again, this is changing because, as I said, there is cross-percolation, cross-pollination of content across platforms themselves. So there is this trans-platform flow of content. But if we really have to strip these platforms down to their essences, what we do see is TikTok did tend to have more of a messy feel to it, where it did want to foreground authenticity. So your bedroom could be messy and then you're just showing a dog-eared book, you're talking about a very personal experience, whereas Instagram tended to be more aesthetically pleasing, where you were still striving for this aesthetically pleasing, perfect image. Again, this is research that has already been done. I do see a trend where this is this is changing, and the boundaries, at least between TikTok and Instagram Reels, are changing a little bit, because there is so much cross-platform flow of content between these two. So feed work really is a direct consequence of having run into a lot of methodological roadblocks along the way, because TikTok in itself, or any platform that I study, is in a sense not a stable environment. So what that means is that I am a part of the environment. So it's almost as much an ethnography of my experience there, so an autoethnography of some sort, as it is a study of what people are doing there. So feed work really just came as a response to some of these questions that I was facing, and some of these, as I said, roadblocks that I couldn't seem to get over with some of the older models of ethnography. Because initially I kept saying that I'm doing digital ethnography, which I am, right? But I am doing it in a very volatile, unstable environment of where algorithms shape the content that I see, and I'm not observing a field as much as I'm being fed one. So my affective responses to the videos that I see will determine what I see next. So feed work really comes from this place of wanting to have a term that allows me to talk about exactly what I do on TikTok. And I'm not saying this because I am doing anything radically new in terms of TikTok research. I think it follows the similar trends of what people are doing on TikTok. But I think it's a new term that allows me to speak about some of the questions that you're asking. So how do I select videos? Because they cannot be objective, because they are being fed to me because of the content that I've engaged with before, because of what I've liked, because of what I've shared with friends. And I think it has also been a conscious decision to use my personal TikTok account, because there are always opportunities to create a research account. And I don't think that really works, because what makes TikTok special, and what makes any of these sort of short video scrolling apps special now, is that they're algorithmically designed for a person. So everyone's feed is different. And while that is a challenge, I think that also provides an opportunity, because I am then able to talk about things, mostly about books, because that's what I look at, that are catered for me. So one of the main things in feed work for me has been this conscious decision to not have a research account, to have my actual account on which, as you've seen, I will watch tennis content, or I will watch content sometimes about makeup. So all of these things come together to create an unstable, volatile, but interesting infrastructure that creates something that's specific to me. So I think that is feed work. It's a mode of digital ethnography that takes into account the ephemerality of content online, and it allows me to do what digital ethnography can do, but in this very volatile environment. Feed work is not specific to TikTok, because what I do is also not specific to TikTok. I am aiming to conduct trans-platform research, and because I look at, for instance, Goodreads, I look at Instagram. I tend to speak more about TikTok in my research, because it is, by a large margin, the most influential platform when it comes to books, at least in parts where TikTok is available. Because the volatility of platforms that I was speaking about is not just about internal instability, but it can also be more geopolitical, larger instability. So for instance, I am from India, although I conduct my research here, but every time I go back home for holiday, I lose access to my object of research, because TikTok is banned in India. And India is just one of the many countries where it's banned. So there's also a geopolitical instability. But I think feed work really then is not just for TikTok. TikTok is how I coined the term, because that's the platform that kept pushing me to find answers for some of the questions that I couldn't answer. But I think feed work is any sort of digital ethnography that happens in a unstable, algorithmically mediated environment.